Have you ever stood on a step, knowing that taking just one more step would make everything explode, yet you chose to stay still? You might call that restraint, but are you sure it isn't fear? And if this morning, while everything was still quiet, you chose not to react, not to prove anything, not to draw your sword, were you becoming weaker or stronger? There was once a samurai who won a battle without ever fighting, not because he avoided it, but because he saw what anger never allows you to see. And when this story ends, you may no longer look at your anger the same way again. Morning in Japan in those days began very early. Before the sun reached the rooftops, the dirt path leading to the water's edge already bore the first footprints. No one spoke. There was only the sound of sandals touching the ground, steady and slow, as if every step were carefully weighed before being placed. Sukahara Bakudon often appeared at that hour. He carried none of the imposing presence of a sword saint. He did not seek the scrutinizing eyes of others. He walked like someone accustomed to not being noticed. On the wooden steps leading down to the dock, he always paused for a brief moment before continuing, not out of fatigue, but as if he were listening to himself. Bakudon had been through enough confrontations to understand that the clash of metal was not always a sign of strength. He practiced the sword every day, but no longer with haste. When the blade was set down, the room returned to silence. No one knew what he was thinking. They only saw him sit still for a long time. As if observing something invisible, on the other side of the story stood someone younger. His breathing was quick. His steps were forceful. This man did not wait for morning. He sought attention, sought recognition, sought a duel to prove where he stood on the ladder of reputation. When he heard the name Bakudon, he did not think of silence. He thought of victory. To people, two rhythms of breath, two ways of walking in the same morning. And it was precisely in the quiet space between those steps that anger began to form, not loudly, but enough to lead them both to the same boat. The challenge did not come on a noisy afternoon. It appeared in the morning, when the waterfront was still empty, when the wooden steps were damp with night dew. The young man stood there earlier than usual. His footsteps were uneven, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Each time he paced back and forth, he stopped at the same spot, as if waiting for someone to emerge from the silence. When Bakudon appeared, nothing changed. He did not quicken his pace. He did not slow it down. The same familiar steps, the same brief pause before the final wooden stair. They stood facing each other, yet there was no posture of readiness for combat, only the space between them, growing more distinct by the second. The young man spoke first. His words moved faster than his thoughts. Sharp phrases were thrown not to kill his opponent, but to force a reaction. Bakudon did not answer right away. He stood still. He did not step forward. He did not step back. His gaze neither avoided nor provoked. The silence stretched longer than necessary. That moment began to create a crisis, not for Bakudon but for the man standing before him. When there was no reaction, anger found no anchor. It turned inward, striking the one who had created it. The young man's foot shifted forward slightly, then stopped, as if the ground beneath him had lost its certainty. At last, Bakudon spoke a single short sentence. Not an acceptance, not a refusal, just a suggestion to go to a small nearby island where they could speak more clearly. No explanation, no added conditions. He turned and stepped down into the boat first, leaving space for the other man to decide. In that moment, the young man stood still for a long time. The path ahead was no longer as clear as it had been when he arrived. If he stepped into the boat, he would move closer to what he thought he wanted. If he did not, he would return with anger still unresolved. The morning remained silent. No one urged him on. No one watched. And it was precisely in that stillness that the real crisis began to take shape. The question of who is stronger, but who is being led by what. The boat left the dock, while the morning still held its original silence. The oars touched the water, forming ripples that spread out and vanished almost instantly, as if they had never existed. Bakudon sat at the bow, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees. He did not look at the man opposite him, nor did he look ahead. His gaze settled on the surface of the water, reflecting a sky that had not yet fully brightened. The younger man stood at the stern. His footing shifted constantly with the movement of the waves, leaning forward at times, hesitating at others. The closer the boat drew to the small island, the clearer the distance between the two became, not a distance of bodies, but a distance between inner states. When the boat reached shore, Bakudon stood first. He stepped onto the island's first stone step and then stopped. He did not turn back. He did not signal. He simply stood there, letting the morning wind pass through his robe. The moment stretched long enough for the other man to believe that the duel was about to begin. The younger man jumped out of the boat. His steps were forceful and decisive, as if each one were meant to prove something. He turned and waited for Bakudon to move forward. But Bakudon did not budge. Instead, he turned back toward the boat. He took hold of the oar. The motion was unhurried. No hesitation. No explanation. Only when the bow of the boat began to pull away from the shore did the younger man realize what was happening. He stood still on the island. He could no longer advance. He could not retreat. Behind him, the steps led only to bare stone. Ahead of him, the water widened by the second. Bakudon rode away in silence. Not to flee, not to mock. He simply left the place where anger was demanding an answer. The boat drifted farther out, leaving behind a man standing motionless, with a sword not yet drawn and a battle that had never begun. In that moment, Bakudon's path became clear. Not the path of victory or defeat, but the path that does not grant anger the right to lead. A resolve that required no vow, no witnesses, only the clarity to know when to remain and when to walk away. Bakudon returned while the morning was still young. On the steps leading up to the training hall, the night dew had not yet fully faded. He stopped at the first step, stood still for a single beat, and only then placed the next step. No one witnessed that moment, yet it was here that discipline began to take shape, not through shouted commands, but through a choice repeated day after day. Every day began this way. Before the bell rang, he was already awake. While the streets were still silent, he had already tied his belt. The wooden door opened softly, just enough for the thin morning light to slip in and rest on the floor. He did not hurry. He did not quicken his pace to prove he was stronger than the day before. He simply walked each step steady, as if climbing an invisible staircase that only he could see. The sword was placed on the floor. Bakudon stood upright, eyes facing forward, then gently closed them. There was no prayer, no expectation, only slow, measured breathing. When his arms rose, they carried no trace of the anger left from the day before. When they lowered, they sought no release. The movements repeated, again and again, until sweat fell onto the floor and the silence grew heavier. Some mornings the body resisted. The steps felt heavier than usual. Time moved slowly. He stood still longer between movements, not to rest, but to avoid giving up. That stillness was not hesitation. It was the decision not to let discomfort lead the way. After training, Bakudon sat down, turning his face toward the light just strong enough to enter through the window. He did not think about the island. He did not think about the man left behind. Instead, he placed his hands on his thighs and allowed the morning to pass through him. In that silence, something else began to emerge, not pride for having won, but a lightness that came from not carrying an unnecessary battle. It was here that gratitude was refined, not through spoken thanks, but through the recognition that he was still free to move forward, grateful that each morning still arrived, grateful that he could still stand on this step, place this foot, and choose silence over reaction. Each time he recognized this, anger lost another place to cling to, and discipline, quietly and without display, began to take root. The days that followed passed without anything remarkable. Morning arrived on time. Training unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Evening closed in silence. From the outside, it would have looked like a tedious repetition, the same path, the same steps, the same brief pause before moving on. There were no explosive moments, no progress that was easy to notice. It was precisely this monotony that became the test, not through pain, but through the feeling that nothing was leading anywhere. On some days, Bakudon stood before his sword longer than usual, not out of hesitation, but because the body wanted something different. It wanted to change the rhythm, to shorten the path, but he did not. He placed his foot in the same old position, as if returning to the same step once again, so many times that counting no longer mattered. The movements repeated until they no longer required thought. When the arm rose, there was no intention to display anything. When it lowered, there was no expectation of results. Sweat appeared steadily, then faded. Morning light slid across the wooden floor at the same angle, day after day. If anything changed, it was that the silence between movements grew deeper. Within that repetition, the things that once provoked anger began to lose their weight, not because they disappeared, but because they had nowhere left to cling. With no novelty to chase, the mind had nowhere to run. It was forced to stay with the step being placed, with the breath moving out. Bakudon stood still between two movements, neither advancing nor retreating, as if testing how long he could remain within the dullness itself. At times, he paused before the steps leading outside and noticed that the light had risen higher than usual. There was no regret, no excitement, only an acknowledgement that morning continued to arrive, whether he expected it or not. And it was precisely in that absence of expectation that gratitude quietly formed. Gratitude for needing nothing else in order to continue. Gratitude for a path that did not demand speed, only that he'd not abandoned it halfway. Monotony was no longer an enemy. It became a silent teacher. Each time Bakudon chose to return to the same familiar step, a part of him stopped seeking validation. Anger, which requires attention in order to survive, gradually found itself without a place to stand, and discipline without needing to be named began to live as a habit, steady, quiet, and independent of the emotions of that particular day. The rain came without warning. The morning that had once felt familiar suddenly turned heavy. Wind swept across the training ground. Water poured down the stone steps and erased the footprints of the day before. Bakudon went outside as he always did. His robe soaked through quickly. The ground was slick. There was no shelter. He stopped at the first step, stood still longer than usual, then stepped down. Not every challenge is loud. Some challenges are simply about continuing when conditions are no longer favorable. Every movement in the rain became twice as heavy. His arms no longer followed their familiar paths. His breath was cut short by the wind. He did not correct himself immediately. He did not force his body toward perfection. He simply continued, as if accepting that today was not a day to move quickly. When the wind grew stronger, Bakudan stood still in the middle of the yard. He did not move forward. He did not step back. The sword lowered. He let the rain run across his face, down his wrists, along the blade as it grew cold. There was no sense of challenge in that moment, only full presence with what was happening. Anger often rises when things go off plan, but here there was no plan to be broken. In the afternoon he sat alone beneath the eaves. The rain had not stopped. Water pooled in thin streams along the steps. No one came. No one asked questions. Bakudan rested his hands on his knees and watched the rain fall without trying to avoid it. In that silence, he realized something. When you do not resist circumstances, circumstances lose their power to force you. When you no longer treat difficulty as an enemy, it becomes part of the path. In the days that followed, the weather shifted constantly. At times the sun was harsh. At others, the cold wind cut into the skin. Bakudan did not adjust his training schedule to wait for better conditions. He adjusted only the way he was present. His steps grew slower. The pauses between movements grew longer. Each morning began with the same choice, to step outside, even when conditions were not ideal, amid storms. Discipline is not forged through physical strength, but through the ability to remain with an uncomfortable morning, to remain on slippery steps, to remain with silence when familiar reactions no longer work. And it is precisely in that remaining that gratitude begins to grow, not because everything is good, but because it is still possible to keep moving forward, even when the path is no longer clear. After days of wind and rain, the path became easier to walk. The training ground was dry. Morning light rose evenly. Footsteps sounded clearer as they landed on the familiar steps. It was precisely then that a different challenge appeared, not from hardship, but from comfort. Someone suggested a detour, a shorter training session, a more efficient way, a path with less repetition, less monotony, less silence. No one forced it. No one provoked. It was simply a gentle invitation, just enough to slow a step at the first stare of the morning. Bakudan stood still, not because he was weighing right and wrong, but because he recognized a familiar sensation returning, the urge to prove he had gone far enough to deserve easing up. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply stood there, observing how his body responded to the pull of convenience. That day's training proceeded as usual, not shortened, not embellished. The movements repeated familiar, yet performed in full. The silence between rhythms was not filled with comparative thoughts. He stepped as if it were the first time, relying neither on reputation nor on the past. At times, Bakudan noticed another path running parallel to his own. It looked flatter, fewer steps, but he did not cross over. Not out of fear of being wrong, but from understanding that each time one changes direction to avoid discomfort, discipline loses a layer of its roots. And when roots are shallow, even a light wind can bring the tree down. An unbreakable spirit does not show itself by enduring more. It shows itself by refusing to negotiate with the things that make one weaker. The next morning arrived as always. He stepped out in silence. He placed his foot on the familiar stair. He did not seek validation. And in that steadiness, gratitude became clearer. Gratitude that this path did not need to be renewed to have value. Gratitude that each step, though repeated, kept him standing firm. When there is no need to prove, no need to change course. The unbreakable spirit does not need to be named. It is present in each small, steady choice, every morning. One morning, Bakudan no longer recognized the moment when effort began. He still woke before the sky fully brightened, still stepped outside in silence, still placed his foot on the old steps. But this time, there was no sense of having to overcome anything. His steps felt lighter, not because his body was stronger, but because his mind was no longer pulling him backward. The training ground was unchanged. The sword remained in its familiar place. Morning light still slid across the floor at the same angle. The only difference was the way he inhabited these things. He no longer strained to maintain discipline. Discipline stood on its own, like breath, like a heartbeat needing no reminder. Others came to observe. They saw no new movements, no unusual techniques. They saw only a man who stood still at exactly the right moments and moved forward in exactly the right rhythm. When there was noise outside, he did not turn. When praise was offered, he did not slow his pace. Any radiance, if it existed, did not come from the attention of others, but from an inner steadiness. On days like these, anger did not vanish entirely. It still visited, like an old habit searching for a way back in. But this time it was no longer welcomed, nor was it driven away. It was simply seen and allowed to pass. Each time, Bakudan realized there was still something to be grateful for. The ability not to be carried away. Grateful that morning continued to arrive, without his demand. Grateful that the steps were still there, unchanged, allowing him to place his foot without needing to prove anything further. Grateful that silence was no longer a void to be filled, but a solid ground on which to stand. Discipline, at this point, was no longer a glow to display. It was something that made others feel calm in his presence, even if they could not say why. It spread not through words, but through rhythm of life. And within that quiet spreading, Bokudon's path completed a circle, not to end, but to continue, each morning, with the same step, the same stare, and a presence that no longer needed to be named. The final challenge did not arrive with shouts or a blade drawn from its sheath. It came on a very familiar morning. The steps were still damp with dew, the foot still landed on the same old place. Silence still covered the training ground, but this time, something was different. A message had been left behind, brief, unsigned, an invitation to return to the island. Bakudon stood before the first step longer than usual. He did not move forward. He did not step back. That stillness was not hesitation, but a moment to look directly at what was knocking from within. Not anger itself, but the memory of anger, the kind that often disguises itself as duty, honor, and the idea of bringing things to a proper end. The boat left the dock once more. The morning kept its slow, steady breath. The oars touched the water so lightly that they did not break the silence. When the island came into view, Bakudon did not search for any figure. He stepped onto the stone step, then stopped. He stood still. He did not call out. He did not wait. He did not place his hand on the sword. Across from him, the younger man from years before appeared. His steps were no longer hurried. His eyes no longer sought collision. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer tense. The morning wind passed through, carrying the scent of salt and damp grass. No one spoke in that moment. The real question emerged not only for Bakudon but for anyone standing before a familiar choice. How do you win when you no longer need to win? Bakudon stood still. He did not advance. He did not retreat. Then he turned back toward the boat. This time, he did not row away immediately. He waited until the other man stepped down from the final stone, making sure that no one was left behind because of their own anger. There was no duel, no loud resolution, only two people leaving the island in silence, each carrying something different away. For Bakudon, it was the final confirmation. Discipline is not meant to defeat others. It exists to keep us from being drawn into battles that have already lost their meaning. The boat reached the shore. Morning continued to move on. The familiar steps waited for the next foot to be placed, and the greatest challenge had passed, not because it was difficult, but because it no longer held the power to govern his choices. After that morning, everything appeared unchanged. The path was the same. The training ground was the same. The wooden steps still gave a soft creak each time a foot was placed upon them. Yet, if one stood long enough in silence, it became clear that something else had shifted. Bakudon no longer carried the story of the island with him. He did not retell it. He did not use it as an example. He did not refer to it as a victory. It closed like a door shut, very gently, quiet enough that no echo remained behind it. Each morning when he stepped outside, he did not check whether he had overcome anything. He simply stepped forward, as if there had never been anything to prove. The change did not lie in technique, nor did it lie in the eyes of others. It lay in the way he stood still. Before, standing still was a way to observe an opponent. Now, standing still was a way not to be pulled away. Before, silence was the pause before action. Now, silence was the place where all action arose and faded. Those who spent time near him began to sense it, not through advice, but through rhythm. When conflict appeared, he did not move faster. When praise arrived, he did not slow down. When the morning felt difficult, he still placed his foot on the same familiar step. That steadiness spread outward quietly, but enough for others to naturally adjust their own pace when they were near him. Anger, once a signal demanding response, had become simply a sign to return. Each time it surfaced, Bakudon discovered another reason for gratitude, the ability to choose. Gratitude for the fact that not every emotion requires an accompanying action. Gratitude that this path allowed him to continue without carrying the past with him. Complete transformation did not turn him into someone else. It brought him back to the original rhythm: slow steps, early mornings, silence thick enough to stand within. There was no challenger left, no island left, only a person continuing forward each day, no longer pulled off course by any battle, walking steadily along the path he had chosen. There are mornings when you stand before the same familiar step and realize you've climbed it and slipped back down too many times, not because you lack strength, but because every step is being pulled backward by an emotion. You haven't faced directly anger, resentment, the feeling that you must win, no matter what. But what if, in that very moment, you chose to stand still, not stepping forward to prove anything, not stepping back to escape, just standing in silence, long enough to see that not every surge of anger needs a reaction, and not every battle deserves your mourning. Gratitude is not a soft emotion. It is the most refined form of discipline. Gratitude that there is still a step to place your foot on. Gratitude that the staircase has not disappeared. Gratitude that silence is still there, offering you another option beyond your familiar reflex. Each time you recognize this, anger loses a measure of its power. When this video ends, you will return to your own morning. There may be no island, no boat, but there will be a very real moment when you must decide. Today, will you step onto that stair with anger or with clarity? Will you let emotion pull you along or let discipline lead the way, one slow step at a time? If this story resonated with you, Take a moment of silence before you leave. And if you want to continue along this path, a path that doesn't require winning against anyone, only not losing yourself, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who may need it, and return again tomorrow morning. The path is still there. The stair is still waiting. The only question is, how will you step